All right, so today we are diving into the world of landscape painting.
Okay.
And you shared this YouTube tutorial with me by Alan Dixon.
Right.
It's called How to Paint a Landscape, Trees, Sky, Fields, Water, Mist, a fully narrated lesson.
Yes.
And wow, this is really cool. Even for someone like me who can barely draw a straight line,
Yeah.
I feel like I could maybe follow along with this guy.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting how accessible these kinds of art instruction videos have become.
Yeah.
And what I really like about Dixon's approach is how much he emphasizes the underpainting.
Oh,
He uses it almost like a blueprint,
mhm.
laying down these broad strokes and thin washes of color just to kind of establish that basic structure of the landscape.
It's interesting you say that because he doesn't like dive into a ton of detail right away. Like he seems very relaxed about the whole thing.
Exactly.
Um, and he uses mineral spirits to keep the paint kind of fluid
Yeah.
and create those soft transitions between colors.
Right.
It's almost like he's working with watercolors at times.
Yeah, exactly. And that technique I think is really key to his approach.
Okay.
Because by thinning the paint with the spirits, it allows him to achieve those really smooth gradients and those atmospheric effects that really give the landscapes a sense of depth and airiness.
Okay.
And he even says at one point, he's like, nothing here is precious at the minute, folks.
I love that. It
Yeah,
kind of reminds me that like sometimes we get so caught up in making things perfect
right.
that we forget to enjoy the process.
Exactly.
Like he's clearly not afraid to make a few happy little accidents along the way.
And he even incorporates those so-called accidents into the painting sometimes.
Does he really?
Yeah, there's a moment where, like, a stray mark on the canvas actually turns into a reflection of a tree in the water.
Oh, wow.
And it's just brilliant. It's this reminder that sometimes those imperfections can actually enhance the final piece.
That's a really good takeaway, I think, for any creative endeavor, really.
Yeah,
Like, sometimes those unexpected detours lead to the most interesting results.
absolutely.
But speaking of unexpected, who would have thought that a greenish-gray sky could be so captivating?
It's an unconventional choice, that's for sure.
Yeah.
But by going with that cooler tone, he kind of sets a very specific mood for the entire piece.
Yeah.
And then notice how he creates that illusion of those distant trees.
Wow.
It's like a whisper of a suggestion rather than a bold statement.
He mentions using a dry brush technique. Is that what's creating that kind of hazy effect?
Exactly. So by using a brush with very little paint on it, he's able to like lift and blend the colors on the canvas,
Uh-huh.
and that creates that soft atmospheric look.
Okay.
And again, it goes back to that emphasis on those soft transitions and creating that sense of depth and atmosphere.
So we've got our underpainting, we've got our moody sky,
Yes.
we've got these suggested distant trees.
Right.
What is next on Dixon's artistic agenda?
So this is where things start to get really interesting. He starts to introduce more defined elements like the house in the distance.
Okay.
But even then, he doesn't get bogged down in minute details.
Interesting.
He keeps it loose and impressionistic, almost allowing the viewer's eye to kind of fill in the blanks.
Right. It's amazing to me how he adds those more defined elements, but he doesn't lose that sense of atmosphere.
Right.
Like he starts bringing in more trees, but they're not like, perfectly rendered trees,
Yeah,
especially the ones further back. It's more about suggesting the detail there, isn't it?
exactly. He understands that not everything needs to be, meticulously defined.
Right.
And by leaving some areas a little bit undefined, it actually enhances the overall realism
Okay.
because it lets the viewer kind of fill in those gaps with their own imagination.
Yeah, it's a technique that takes confidence, I would say,
Definitely.
and a deep understanding of how the eye perceives depth and detail.
Absolutely.
I also noticed that he's not afraid to get his hands a little dirty, literally.
Yeah.
He embraces a bit of finger painting in his process.
Well, sometimes you don't need those fancy brushes.
Right.
It's refreshing to see an artist just go for it.
Yeah, exactly.
And there's even a point where he uses his finger to soften a hard line in the water reflection.
Oh, really?
And it just highlights this crucial point that sometimes the simplest solutions are the most effective.
Yeah.
It's not about adhering to some rigid set of rules. It's about achieving the desired effect.
Use what works.
Right.
Exactly. And speaking of things that work, I love how he subtly guides the viewer's eye through the painting.
Mm-hmm.
Like there's this pathway that kind of emerges between the trees that leads you deeper into the scene.
Yeah, that pathway is a great example of how even a small detail can have a big impact on
Yeah.
the overall composition. It's subtle, but it adds this narrative element, almost inviting the viewer to like step into the landscape and explore.
And he plays with this thing called lost and found edges,
Yes.
where some of the edges are like sharp and defined, and others just kind of blend into the surrounding colors.
Yeah.
I don't think I would have picked up on that if I wasn't looking for it.
It's a subtle detail, but it makes a big difference.
Yeah.
Lost and found edges is a technique that's used to create depth and atmosphere.
Okay.
So think about like looking at a forest in real life. Some trees are in sharp focus while others kind of fade into the background.
Yeah.
And by alternating between these sharp and blended edges, he's mimicking that effect
Wow.
and creating a more visually engaging and realistic landscape.
It's amazing how much thought goes into each brushstroke.
It really is.
So let's talk about those water reflections, because it's not just like a mirror image of the sky.
Right.
There's a real sense of depth and movement there.
Yeah.
How does he achieve that?
So his approach to the water is actually quite fascinating
Okay.
because he starts with this surprisingly dark, almost graphic base
All right.
instead of like jumping straight into those like shimmery reflections.
Mm.
This darker base establishes the depth of the water and it prevents it from looking flat and unrealistic.
Okay, so then he layers on those subtle variations of color using a technique called glazing.
Precisely. Glazing involves applying these thin, translucent layers of color over that dried base layer.
Okay.
And this allows the underlying colors to show through, and it creates a sense of depth and luminosity.
And it's like he doesn't just stop there either.
Okay.
It's those final details that really bring the water to life.
Yeah.
Like adding those tiny little white dots to suggest light sparkling on the surface.
It's amazing how such a simple detail can make such a big difference, right?
Yeah, like it seems so simple, but it really adds a lot.
It does. It adds that extra layer of visual interest and realism
Right.
that just elevates the whole thing.
Yeah, and it's not just in art, I think.
Right.
It's like that in life, too. Sometimes those small details
Absolutely.
have the biggest impact.
That's true.
I also love how he's not afraid to let those layers of color kind of peek through.
Yeah.
It gives the painting this wonderful texture and depth.
Yeah, it's almost like you can see the history of each brushstroke.
Exactly.
And he uses a technique called scumbling to do that, where you basically drag a dry brush with a little bit of paint on it over a dry layer.
Mm-hmm.
And it allows the colors underneath to kind of show through.
And it prevents the painting from looking too, like, polished or overworked. That thing.
Right, it adds that natural feel.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I don't know if you noticed this, but he doesn't actually say that the painting is finished at this point.
Yeah, he mentions that he might revisit it later.
Right.
Which I thought was really interesting.
Like with fresh eyes.
Yeah, and it made me think, like, a work of art is never really truly finished, is it?
That's a good point.
You can always refine it. You can always see it from a new perspective.
You know, I think that's a great philosophy for life in general.
Totally.
To always be open to learning and growing and to revisiting our past experiences with fresh eyes, as you said. So as we kind of like step back and admire Dixon's finished landscape here,
Yeah.
what are some of the key takeaways that you hope that our listeners are walking away with today?
Well, I hope they feel inspired to experiment more in their own creative pursuits
Okay.
and to embrace those imperfections because, as we saw with Dixon, sometimes those unexpected detours can lead to the most interesting results.
Yeah.
And I also hope they gained a deeper appreciation for the power of observation.
Right.
You know, really paying attention to those small details that often hold the greatest beauty.
Beautifully said.
Thank you.
It's been a fascinating deep dive into the world of landscape painting with Ellen Dixon.
Yeah, it has.
I feel like we learned some really valuable techniques.
Definitely.
But we were also reminded of the importance of like embracing imperfection,
Yes.
finding beauty in the details,
It's all connected.
and always being open to new perspectives.
Absolutely.
So until next time, keep exploring, keep creating, and keep diving deep.
Couldn't agree more.